Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us for tonight's webinar about eastern coyotes. We're going to give it a few more minutes to let any last few participants join, and then we'll go ahead and get started. So thank you for your patience. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us for tonight's special webinar. My name is Regan Downey, and I'm the Director of Education at the Wolf Conservation Center. Before we get started, just a bit of housekeeping. If you have any questions, please type them into the question and answer box on your control panel, and we'll provide time at the end to answer these questions. A recorded version of the webinar will also be available within a few days on the Wolf Conservation Center's website. Tonight, we are joined by Dana Goin, the Wolf Conservation Center's Wildlife Outreach Specialist, to discuss the history and ecology of eastern coyotes and how we can best coexist with these wonderful creatures. Dana Goin works as the Wildlife Outreach Specialist at the Wolf Conservation Center. She's focused on educating the public on the local wildlife with whom we share the landscape and how to best foster peaceful coexistence with them. After receiving her degree in wildlife conservation from the University of Delaware, she went on to travel around the country as a wildlife technician. Dana's study species include mountain lions, coyotes, bobcats, gray foxes, raccoons, possums, and white-tailed deer. She has researched large carnivore populations in megacities such as Los Angeles, predator-prey dynamics and movement, and the efficacy of rabies vaccination baits on mesocarnivores. So without any further ado, I'll turn things over to Dana.
Hi, everyone, and thank you for that introduction, Regan. As she said, my name is Dana Goin. I'm the Wildlife Outreach Specialist here at the Wolf Conservation Center. And today we are here to talk about the history and ecology of eastern coyotes. So I'm just going to start out with a few, oh, hang on, my mouse is no longer cooperating. There we go. I'm just going to start out with a few kind of basics about eastern coyotes so we really get an idea of the animal that we're discussing throughout this program. And then as we go on, we'll kind of get more into the nitty-gritty of things and really talk about coexistence, behaviors, and what to really expect from eastern coyotes. So an eastern coyote is a subspecies of coyote. They live throughout the Northeast. They're typically about the size of a border collie. Males tend to be slightly larger than females, but not necessarily. And really on average, they weigh about 20 to 45 pounds, although you might have a few outliers, but they tend to be actually significantly smaller than most people anticipate. Their appearance is typically gray, maybe gray-brown. The photo that we have here is kind of your standard coloration that you might expect from eastern coyotes, but their coloration can actually vary quite widely. So they might be black, a little bit more gray or silver, red in color, and we even have a few individuals that live just in the woods surrounding the Wolf Conservation Center that are completely blonde in color. So this variation really contributes to these cases of mistaken identity that we often have with eastern coyotes. They have these very characteristic fluffy tails, and they will typically walk with those tails hanging straight down. And then of course they have these large pointed ears. So this is a graphic that I put together so we could really get an idea of the size of this species. So we have our typical domestic cat. They tend to be about 8 to 10 pounds, although I've admittedly had larger house cats than that. Then coyotes tend to be, again, 20 to 45 pounds. Labrador retrievers, that's just a breed of dog that I selected because they tend to be one that we're quite familiar with. They're 55 to 80 pounds. And then gray wolves on average are 80 to 120 pounds. So we're talking today about eastern coyotes. So throughout the Northeast, unfortunately, there are no longer any gray wolves. But I like this comparison because if you were somewhere maybe out west or maybe up in Canada where you had populations of coyotes and gray wolves overlapping, just their size difference alone would be a quick way to differentiate which individual you might be looking at. So as far as their range goes, they're actually found in every US state except for Hawaii. They first arrived in the Northeast in about the 1930s, and it's thought that they went up north through Canada and made their way down before spreading throughout the Northeast of the US. So they actually originated out west. So there are multiple subspecies, and the reason they were able to expand their range eastward is because unfortunately wolves and other large carnivores were largely eradicated from the landscape. So in their absence, eastern coyotes were then able to naturally expand their range eastward because without wolves in the area, there was a lot of vacant and very desirable territory. So coyotes were able to, being a very adaptable species, naturally start to take over a lot of that typical territory that they may have been excluded from if wolves were in the area. And they can really live anywhere. They can live in rural areas, suburbs. They love living in parks. We see them all the time on golf courses. And of course, we're starting to see them in many cities as well. So the first known coyote in New York City was spotted in 1946. I say New York City because, of course, that is the closest city to the Wolf Conservation Center. And she unfortunately was later hit by a car, but they did erect a statue in her honor in one of the parks. So hopefully this graphic is moving on your end, but this is a map that was created by Roland Kays, who's a very well-known coyote biologist. And you can see each color kind of indicates a decade of movement for those coyotes. So this is kind of an estimate, but that red shows you their historic range where they really started out west. And then as each decade progresses, you can see that these coyotes have started to naturally expand north a little bit and east as well. So in terms of their general background, they are classified as carnivores, but coyotes actually follow a much more omnivorous diet. So they are generalists and they are opportunistic. So that means where there's something edible, coyotes will likely be trying to eat it. So we will see a lot of seasonal variation in their diets. Particularly in the summer, you might see that they're eating a lot more berries, a lot more vegetation. In the winter, they might be eating more smaller rodents or scavenging on a lot of carcasses that they may encounter. So we'll really see that they'll eat kind of whatever is easily available to them. They're not particularly picky. In terms of their communication, scent marking is one of the key ways that coyotes communicate with one another. So they are territorial animals. And that means that in order to mark their territory and exclude other coyotes that are not considered part of their family group, they will indicate these barriers and these boundaries with scents. So that is typically pee and poop. So they will mark their territory by leaving these olfactory cues for other individuals to pick up and say, okay, I can really tell that this area is occupied and patrolled, and I probably shouldn't enter if I'm not looking for trouble. Body language is another key way that coyotes communicate. So they will communicate not necessarily always vocally. So ear positions, whether or not they're baring their teeth, tail positions, whether or not the fur on their neck is standing up, even just the way they hold their bodies. These are all really important ways that they are going to communicate with other individuals. And then of course, vocalizations is probably one of the most famous ways that coyotes communicate. Howling is a big way that they will vocally communicate. Howling can serve a lot of purposes, but one of the most frequent purposes is probably advertising that their territory is occupied. So they want to advertise to other individuals that this area is occupied and that you probably shouldn't come this way if you're not potentially seeking conflict. We frequently get reports of folks hearing coyotes in their backyards. They say, oh, it sounds like there's at least a dozen. I hear them every night. And coyotes are very interesting in that they have these sort of hollow sounding howls. They will also yip and howl and bark and make all kinds of different sounds. And the way they change the pitch of their voices actually makes it sound like there are more individuals in that group than there actually are. And you can imagine that's going to be very beneficial to sound like you're a larger, potentially more threatening group, without actually having to, sustain or feed a large group like that. So it's one of the many interesting things about coyotes. For their activity, they are not strictly nocturnal. So this is one of the common misconceptions about coyotes, that if we see them out during the day, that they must be sick. There must be something wrong with them. And in reality, because coyotes are opportunistic and because they're generalists, they're really going to be out whenever there's available food. And that will also change seasonally, just like their diets will. So for example, when they have young pups that they need to feed, that of course will increase their nutritional needs. And so they're going to be out scavenging and hunting for food a little bit more frequently. Particularly this time of year, if we see coyotes out and about during the day, it doesn't necessarily mean there's something wrong with them. It probably means they're caring for pups somewhere. And then in terms of their family life, they are monogamous. There have been studies that compare coyotes to other species that we consider monogamous, such as Arctic foxes, certain bird species, and they've found that given the opportunity, those other species will frequently seize the opportunity to philander, whereas coyotes remain very faithful to their mates. And in this standard pack or family group, the adult male and female, or the breeding pair, they're really the core of the group. They make all the major decisions, they kind of establish all the rules, and the rest of the individuals, who are typically their offspring, will kind of follow suit. So I think it's really important that we have a better understanding of a year in the life of a coyote. This really informs a lot of their behaviors, and it gives us a better idea of what to expect from them. So I like to think of these programs, this is a program that I give quite frequently in local communities, and I like to think of these as a little bit of a fire drill. Typically a fire isn't necessarily something that we have to worry about, but of course you want to know what to do. So I like to think of these as just a little bit of, a practice round, so we know what to expect. So January to March is when coyotes are going through courtship and mating. So again, they are a monogamous species, but even within their own breeding pairs, they will still go through these courtship behaviors. They're also monoestrous, which means that they only really go into heat one time per year. So that will be in those winter months at the start of the year. March to April is when their pups are born. So a coyote's gestation period, or how long the female is pregnant, is about 62 to 63 days. So really just 2 months. Their litter sizes are about 4 to 6 pups, although of course that might vary. And what's very interesting about coyotes is that offspring from previous litters might stick around as sort of babysitters, or we call them helpers. So they will often stay with their parents even into adulthood, and they will help out. So that can be crucial in terms of socialization of those young pups, defending the territory, providing food. And it's one of the reasons coyotes are so successful, because they have such a strong family group. May to August is pup rearing. So pups really only stay in the den for the first 4 to 5 weeks of their lives. So when we see something in our yards that may or may not resemble a coyote den, likely some animal was denning there and they've moved on. I've had folks call me and say, I have these pups tumbling around on my property. I'm not particularly worried about them, but how long are they going to be here? And oftentimes at the point where they're really out and moving around and mobile, able to keep up with their parents, it means they're likely going to move on from that area pretty soon. Pups are going to start weaning around 5 to 7 weeks of age. And again, this is going to help with their ability to keep up with their family, because they're not as dependent on their mother's milk. So they might be able to be left for a little bit longer, but they're also going to be able to follow their family around and of course, try solid food. And that's going to be really important for their survival going forward. And then October to December is dispersal. So if we have adult individuals in a family group that have the desire to breed, they actually have to strike out on their own. They have to seek out their own territory, find their own mate. And so they're of course going to want to do that before breeding season. So we often hear an uptick in sightings in kind of the fall. And that is partly because that's when you have those kind of adolescent individuals striking out and finding their own territory. Sometimes that might mean they're traveling maybe 60 to 100 miles looking for vacant territory. And it's also a time of year where there's not a whole lot of vegetation. A lot of those leaves are falling off the trees and landing on the ground. So there's really not that much cover. So we tend to see a lot more sightings at that time of year. So I want to touch on a few common myths as we're moving forward. So the first is the term coy wolf. If we were in person, I would of course ask all of you if you had ever heard that term. It's a term that I hear thrown around, particularly in the Northeast, in reference to these animals that people might catch on maybe their security cameras or see out on a hike or something like that. They'll say, oh, that doesn't look like a coyote, it looks like a coy wolf. Well, the reality is that all eastern coyotes are actually somewhat of a mix. So what this word implies is that the animals we're talking about, eastern coyotes, it tells us that they're 50% coyote and 50% wolf. But like I said earlier, unfortunately, there are no longer any wolves remaining in the Northeast. So it couldn't be possible that we would have an individual that was 50-50. But our eastern coyotes as a subspecies, they have found through a few research projects that they're actually the result of hybridization between various canids that happened decades and decades ago. So this happened kind of through that natural range expansion that I touched on earlier, where wolves were removed from the landscape through many, hunting campaigns, poisoning campaigns, and you might have had a few straggling individuals behind. When animals have access to individuals of their own species, they're not likely going to hybridize with other individuals. But in these situations where coyotes were moving eastward and they may have encountered the occasional wolf, you might see some hybridization there. So in research conducted by Javier Monzon when he was at Stony Brook University, he's a coyote biologist as well, he examined the genetic makeup of 437 eastern coyotes. He found that on average, they were about 64% coyote. This really ranged between 64 to about 81%. And then that they had some sort of mixture of gray wolf, eastern wolf, and dog. So these hybridization events are no longer actively occurring in the United States, but that is why we have a little bit of confusion around the individuals living in our own backyards. So biologists tend to really steer people towards calling them eastern coyotes instead of coy wolf, because that term really kind of makes people a little bit alarmed. They take what maybe is the most terrifying aspect of each individual species and they combine them and they imagine that this individual is this kind of fearsome beast, when in reality, they're really just eastern coyotes. One difference that we do see is that eastern coyotes on average are about 10 pounds larger than their western counterparts. So not that significant. And again, they range between 20 to 45 pounds. So really not terribly large. Where we do have coy wolves that do potentially exist are in places where, again, there might not be very many individuals. So this photo here shows these kind of mystery canids, and this was taken near Galveston, Texas. And what we're seeing here are species that are suspected to be a combination of critically endangered red wolves and coyotes. And through some genetic testing, they have found that some coyote species there do have a little bit of red wolf DNA. But in the only place where red wolves actively live right now, there are 18 red wolves living in the wild. They live in a small protected area in North Carolina. And that is one of the challenges currently facing their recovery, is that those individuals occasionally will hybridize with eastern coyotes. So for those of us that live in the Northeast, we're not really saying that we have coy wolves. We have eastern coyotes, but this doesn't mean that an animal that you could call a coy wolf absolutely doesn't exist, just not around here. The next myth I want to talk about is one that I hear very, very frequently. You can imagine that I'm in a lot of kind of neighborhood Facebook groups, a lot of nature groups, and I'll hear this so frequently when people have a coyote sighting in their yard. So this myth goes that coyotes are going to lure your dog into the woods where the rest of the pack is waiting to unfortunately attack and harm your dog. So they kind of posit that a coyote pack will send out an individual to entice your dog to, pique their curiosity, get them to maybe play, and then to follow them to the rest of the group. And what's actually happening is that although coyotes are quite clever, I think we're giving them a little bit of too much credit in this situation. They are quite clever, but you know, they're going to have a lot of similar behaviors and similar methods of communication to our dogs. They're not all that distantly related. So it's not impossible that a coyote might be curious about your dog, or of course your dog curious about a coyote. They might play, they might try to communicate. I will say we should never let our pets interact with wild animals. It's really not safe for our pets, and of course it's not safe for the wildlife either. But here we have a picture of a dog chasing a coyote down a trail. This is taken in an urban park in San Francisco. And this dog is chasing this coyote down a trail. You can imagine that, let's say hypothetically they're playing. We have this coyote and this dog, they're interested in each other. But if this coyote gets a little overwhelmed, if she's starting to feel maybe she's in over her head, she might start to retreat. And if she retreats to an area where maybe the rest of her family is resting during the day, and a dog follows her to that area, of course, what they're seeing is a potential threat in their midst. So of course that could end really poorly for one of our beloved pets. So it's really important that we, again, don't allow our pets to interact with wildlife, that we keep them on leash, particularly in areas where there's a known coyote presence. And of course that we work on their recall and make sure that they're coming back to us, because this could be a terrible situation for the coyotes or for our dogs. So it's not really a natural behavior that we're seeing luring, it's just really a misunderstood correlation. So in terms of coyotes living in urban areas, we tend to think of them as urban areas as really anti-nature. But in reality, there are hundreds of wild species that live in these urban environments. They're just not ones that we necessarily think of as wild. So when we have coyotes that in that situation would be considered potentially a large size carnivore, at least in that context, when we have them surviving and even thriving in urban environments, it's a really good indicator that that environment is actually quite healthy. Because you can imagine kind of top of the food chain individuals, they have a lot of dietary needs. So coyotes might eat rodents, they might eat rabbits, they might eat birds. And of course, all of those individuals have needs as well. So their ability to thrive at the top of the food chain really indicates that every level of that food chain is really hitting all of their nutritional needs to reach survival, to the point of unfortunately becoming someone's prey. So, you know, when we have coyotes living in urban environments, of course, they're eating there, and that means that they are going to be going to the bathroom there as well. So bear with me here. This is where sometimes I get a few eye rolls, but for me personally, I think this is quite interesting, being able to identify the presence of an animal in a non-invasive way. And so scat, of course, which is a natural way that coyotes will produce waste, but also a way that they will mark their territories. It's a great indicator of the presence of a certain species. So at any time someone goes on a walk with me, we will stop very frequently because I'm constantly looking at the side of the trail. So just like us using these walking trails, coyotes, bobcats, even deer, they love to use trails as well because it's an easy way to get from point A to point B. So we will oftentimes see indicators that they've been there, either through tracks or through scat on the side of the trail. So if you're interested, you can get to know the characteristics of coyote scat. It tends to be sort of long and cylindrical, and it might have a tapered end. And sometimes it even has a rope-like consistency because they're consuming a lot of furry mammals that, of course, have lots of hair, and that will kind of be visible in that scat. And you might see some bones in there as well. So if you're so curious, you can really take a stick and break it up and examine what's inside. You'll oftentimes see bones, you might see vegetation. And again, it's a really great way to identify the presence of a species in an area. So this is a little bit of a breakdown. So on the left here, we have a scat sample that has been dissected. So in one of my previous positions, I worked with the National Park Service as an intern years ago, and I assisted with the LA Urban Coyote Project. And what we were doing was training community scientists and volunteers to identify and collect scat samples and then bring them back to us, mark on their GPSs where they found them. We would assign them different urban parks that they would periodically go to and kind of scan for these scat samples. And what we wanted to do was to compare their urban diets to the diets that they would have in these more natural spaces. So some of us were actually in those green spaces in the mountains doing these surveys as well. And so we would bring these samples back, we would sterilize them, they get washed pretty efficiently, if you can believe it, and then we would have what we called scat dissection parties. So we would all sit in a large group and we would take these scat samples, and with our tools, you can see some of those tools at the top of the screen, we would start to pull apart these scat samples. Not for everybody, I guess, but it was very interesting to really get a kind of microscopic look at these diets. So on the left, you can see a lot of the bone matter that's been pulled out. There's a plastic bottle cap that was not in the scat, but 2 bones below that is a rat jaw. You can see some ribs in there as well. And on the right is just kind of the fibrous material, the fur that's really been pulled out. And so we can look at these jaws and these different bones and identify what these coyotes have eaten down to species and sometimes even subspecies. And this is a really crucial way to get to really know what these diets are and how they might vary in urban environments and more natural environments. So Urban Coyote Initiative, a different organization, they analyzed 1,400 scat samples. You can imagine that these scat projects are really going on nationwide. And they found that 42% of these scat samples contained small rodents, 23% contained fruit, 22% contained deer, 18% contained rabbit, and about 2% had human garbage, 1.3% showed evidence of cats. I believe this all adds up to more than 100%. I haven't done the math in a while, but that's because some of these samples are going to show multiple of each. So they might have rodents and rabbit. When they have deer in their scat, most often that is from deer that they've scavenged. So roadkill deer, deer that have died from natural causes. It's actually very unlikely that eastern coyotes are really taking down healthy adult deer. They might be able to take down a deer that's already ailing, but it's very rare that they're going to take down adult deer. In the spring and summer, they will frequently prey upon newly born fawns, but aside from that, their deer consumption is largely from scavenging. Now, I know looking at this, probably one of the most alarming parts of it is evidence of cats. And this is just a reminder that, you know, the best way to keep our pets from becoming prey is to keep them indoors. I always worry that I don't sound like I love cats, and that couldn't be further from the truth. I have 4 foster kittens at home. But it's really important and to remember, and maybe a little bit grim to think about, but you know, when we do let our pets outside unattended, in a sense, we are re-entering them into the food chain, whether they're predator or prey. So it's really the best way to keep them protected is to keep them indoors and prevent this from ever happening. So this brings me, of course, to our keys to coexistence. So these are kind of the tools that we can walk away with from this program and things that we can really apply in order to better coexist with our neighborhood coyotes. So the first one is probably very obvious to all of us: do not feed coyotes. So this photo right here is, of course, a coyote eating a Happy Meal. Although that might be relatable, it's not something that we necessarily want to see. So, of course, intentional feeding of coyotes is a big no-no. With coyotes, with bears, with lots of wildlife, what we'll say is a fed coyote is a dead coyote, a fed bear is a dead bear. And what that tells us is that feeding them really acclimates them to people. It creates more of a comfort than is natural. So they're naturally quite wary. And ultimately that might result in what we would consider inappropriate behavior. So coyotes becoming too acclimated, approaching people, not being fearful when we try to scare them away. And ultimately that might result in their lethal removal from an area. So although many people feed wild animals because they love them, really the best thing we can do if we love these animals or if we hate them is to not intentionally feed them. Unintentional feeding happens frequently as well. So one way that we unintentionally feed coyotes is through bird seed. So although coyotes aren't necessarily going to be directly consuming bird seed, although I wouldn't put it past them, if any of us have bird feeders in our backyards, you're probably very familiar with the frequency of squirrels, of mice, of chipmunks trying to get at that bird seed. And of course, those animals are species that coyotes will frequently consume. So by attracting them to our yard, you might then be attracting their predators. So coyotes, hawks, a lot of animals that might be seeking to prey upon them. So one thing that we can really do is try to exclude those animals from our bird feeders, pick up fallen bird seed, make sure that we're not creating a consistent attractant. Same goes for fallen fruit. We have a lot of ornamental fruit trees. Coyotes will directly eat that fruit, whether it's on the tree or fallen. And so making sure that we pick up that fallen fruit as well, because not only will it attract those rodents, but it'll also attract coyotes. And then pet food. We want to make sure that we're not feeding our pets outdoors. If we are, that we're cleaning it up promptly. We're not leaving it out overnight for all sorts of animals to get into. Because again, coyotes are opportunists, and if they see a bowl of kibble, they will probably try to eat it. We want to secure our garbage, compost, and recycling. So if we're seeing a lot of coyote activity, making sure we're putting out garbage and recycling the morning of pickup, compost maybe somehow enclosing it so that we're really not attracting coyotes to that food smell. Do not leave our pets outdoors unsupervised. So I touched on this a little bit, but one thing I see frequently is kind of a sense of complacency when we have fenced in yards. Now, coyotes are great jumpers, and they're also pretty adept at climbing, and they can really get over fences as high as 6 feet. So it's really important that, you know, we keep our pets supervised. If we're out on hikes with them, that we keep them on leash with us. Again, we really don't want them to be subject to potential conflict with wildlife. And then removing water sources. So here in the Northeast, we don't necessarily see this very frequently. We do have a kind of a lot of natural water sources, but it's something to think about if we're seeing a lot of coyote activity, potentially removing those water sources to stop attracting them to that particular area. So this as a visual probably looks like a bunch of nonsense right off the bat. I will explain it. So this is a screenshot taken from the Narragansett Bay Coyote study. And this was a few years ago. They had collared a few coyotes. So they were fitted with GPS collars. And a GPS collar is a really great tracking tool for wild animals. And what these collars do is they take periodic GPS points. So just like our phones do, our cars do, and they will report those points back to a biologist. Over time, you can look at what are called clusters, or you can look at their movement, and you can get an idea of their territory size, their home range, whether or not they're traveling with other collared individuals. You'll be able to identify den sites, and areas that they frequent. So here we're seeing 2 clusters. You can kind of ignore all the different colors and the lines and everything like that. That really just indicates time of day. But what we really want to look at is these 2 clusters. So this indicates that periodically this individual is returning to these spots very frequently. These points were taken over a period of about 3 to 5 weeks. And so what these researchers did is they visited those sites. They thought, it's likely an easily available food source. So they found at the northernmost site, those homeowners were actively feeding those coyotes, and so they issued a warning. And at the southern site, they found that they were feeding coyotes as well, and they kind of gently asked them, hey, why do you think there are so many coyotes around here? And so what happened is that those homeowners then removed those food sources, those attractants to coyotes. So 3 to 5 weeks later, this is what those GPS points looked like. So you can see how quickly these individual coyotes learned, okay, there's no longer any food here, we need to move on. And this really shows us how our behavior can so readily influence the activity and the movement of coyotes. So it's really important to remember that we don't want to leave attractants in our yard for wild animals because ultimately they might become dependent on them, and it might create a lot of unnatural activity. So this kind of brings me to the conflict end of things. So of course, you know, we really want coyotes living in our areas, although they do unfortunately have a bad reputation. They are really, really crucial species, and I'll talk about that in a few moments. But in order to avoid conflict, so coyotes becoming a little bit more emboldened towards people, because again, they are very clever individuals, so they will learn over time that, you know, if there's an easy food source or maybe a nice neighbor, that they're going to kind of stick around. So what we want to do is haze coyotes. Now this might sound a little bit mean, but what we really want to do is reinforce their natural wariness. So we will do that by scaring them away from us, our houses, and our yards. And we do this through the use of loud sounds and really exaggerated motions. So that is yelling, clapping, waving your hands, taking your coat or your backpack off and kind of waving it around. It's really more important to vary your hazing. So if you're the only person in your neighborhood who is, screaming and yelling and clapping when you see a coyote walk through your yard, that coyote's just going to learn to avoid your yard. So this is why we focus a lot of these efforts on communities, trying to get people to understand that as neighbors, it's really crucial that we all commit to hazing coyotes. This of course makes coyotes sound very scary, but really we're just reinforcing their natural behaviors, their natural fear of us. So varying your hazing with different people, with different sounds, whether it's clapping, using a whistle, using a pot and pan, they make little pocket-sized air horns. There's lots of different things we can do, but that's really the best way to continue reinforcing that fear. If they're a safe distance away, you can certainly quietly observe them. They are really fascinating to watch, but if they start to approach, you really want to start hazing them. So I've been wandering around here on the grounds of the Wolf Conservation Center before. I have quite a few trail cameras around here, and I'll talk about those a little bit later as well. But I've seen coyotes around here, and although I'd love to stand there and observe them, what I do if they start to approach me, most often they just don't even realize I'm standing there, is I will start to yell, I'll start to clap, or I'll even just say, "Hey coyote, I see you." And they'll look up at me and they run in the other direction. Now, although I'd love to continue observing them and probably even taking photos with them, I know that it's really important for them to remain fearful of people. And so I try to reinforce that. And if we think coyotes are sick or injured, we want to then call your local wildlife agency, maybe your local police department, and have them come out and assess the situation. You wouldn't want to apply hazing in those circumstances. So this is why killing coyotes doesn't work. So I will see this frequently in local villages, in towns, that there's an uptick in coyote sightings. Everyone gets very upset, gets very afraid, and so the town will hire a contractor to then remove those coyotes lethally. So they will kill them. And so what happens is this completely destabilizes the pack. And I want to note that this also applies to relocating individuals, because that's a frequent question that I will get. Well, we don't want to kill them, but can't we move them somewhere else? And you will have the same impact. So here we have a stable pack. We have A for alpha, so that breeding pair at the top. This year's offspring is kind of that tangerine color, those smaller pups. And then maybe other individuals in their family group are those other pink and blue coyotes right there. When we start going in and killing coyotes, indiscriminately removing any individual that we might be able to catch or shoot or poison in whatever way, what happens is it causes complete chaos in these stable pack structures. So now we have this adult female breeding with an individual that's from outside that territory. Because we've removed adult individuals from this population, of course, now there's more abundant food because those adults are no longer consuming all of those rodents that they would have needed to sustain themselves. So it's more abundant. So this female can now have a larger litter size. Then we have a purple and green coyote, so two individuals from outside the area. They're breeding, they're having a relatively large litter size as well. We have that coyote's pups who are probably not fully grown. They're probably maybe 1 or 2 years old. They might have stayed with their family a few more years had that family remained stable, but now they're going to start breeding as well. And so you will have younger individuals having more pups. And what we have then is more breeding pairs having larger litter sizes. So we call this the rebound effect. So you might see a temporary dip in that population size following the removal of some individuals, and then you see a boom in that population. And they're really just responding to the new temporary abundance of food. So this doesn't really solve the perceived problem that we had, and instead it actually creates a much larger population. In addition to that, some of these individuals don't exactly know what to do, so they might be targeting livestock animals, going after people's pets. What we really want to do is support the coyote population that lives in our area. because if they're not really causing any issues for humans, what they're doing is excluding other coyotes from coming into that area that might introduce a little bit of conflict. So we really want to protect our population that is around us and allow them to continue. Of course, we don't want to feed them, but we really want that population to remain as stable as possible. So to kind of wrap up, I really just want to touch on some benefits, some ecosystem services that coyotes provide. Now, I think it's important to note that we probably shouldn't assign value to individual animals based on how we ourselves benefit from them, but I do think it's really important that we kind of have these ideas in our head of why coyotes are such crucial members of the ecosystem, because there is such abundant misunderstanding of them. So for one, coyotes clean up the environment by scavenging. So as I mentioned before, with deer, with other roadkill, they will clean up that carrion by eating it. That helps prevent the spread of a lot of diseases, a lot of parasites, and of course, you know, it keeps things pretty clean. We would be pretty unhappy if we were walking around and saw tons and tons of animal carcasses. So scavengers get a bad rep, but they are really, really crucial. Coyotes encourage biodiversity, so they control the mesopredator populations. So examples would be opossums, raccoons, foxes, skunks. A lot of these animals will prey on songbird nests. And so being one step above them in that food chain, they kind of maintain that population at a decent number, and they allow those songbirds to then reach maturity and continue having offspring. So they really do encourage biodiversity that way. They help prevent the spread of Lyme disease. So by preying on rodents and other small mammals, which we know can be carriers of Lyme and other zoonotic diseases, they help to limit those diseases from spreading. In general, those rodent populations are controlled. So where there are people, there are inevitably rodents. So, you know, it's great to have a really, you know, thriving coyote population around you, because they will really kind of keep that rodent population under control. And then just kind of more sentimentally, coyote packs are families. Again, we have that monogamous pair of breeding individuals. They work together with their pups to raise the youngest individuals of that year. They form incredibly strong social bonds and have really complex social dynamics. And they've even shown grieving behaviors when individuals go missing or are killed. So what we can do. The best thing we can do if we like coyotes, and I really hope we all do, but I understand if we're a little apprehensive still, the best thing we can do is keep their fear of humans intact. And then the best thing you can do if you don't like coyotes is keep their fear of humans intact. So it's very simple to remember. So we just want to apply these hazing techniques, and ultimately that is going to be the best way that we can learn to coexist with coyotes and really reduce human-coyote conflict. Okay, so I'm all set, Regan. I'm sure we have lots of questions. I will actually turn my video on so you guys can see me.
Great, thank you so much, Dana. And yes, we do have a lot of questions. In case anyone joined us a few minutes late, we are with Dana Goin, the Wildlife Outreach Specialist at the Wolf Conservation Center, and we are now moving into our question and answer portion of tonight's program. If you do have a question, please type it into the question and answer box at the bottom of your screen, and we'll make our best efforts to answer as many questions tonight as we can. If we're unable to get to your question, we do apologize. However, we do have many resources on our website about how to coexist with eastern coyotes and more information about their history and biology as well. I will also post a link to this page in the chat too. So Dana, I think one of the first questions, it was asked several times, is what should people do, particularly this time of year, if they see a coyote with pups?
That is a great question. So this would probably apply to most wild species, is give them a lot of space. It's of course very tempting when we see young pups, especially coyote pups that, you know, probably remind us of our dogs. It's tempting to approach to try to get photos, but what we really want to do is give them as much space as possible, particularly because adult coyotes, of course, are going to probably feel a little bit defensive of their young pups. If we put it in the most unsentimental of terms, it's a large energy expense to have pups. Of course, they have, stronger bonds than just saying, this took a lot of energy, but it's really in their best interest to try to protect, this energy that they've kind of put out there. So it's really important that we give them a lot of space. One behavior that we will frequently see this time of year, so again, June is when pups are going to start being a little bit more mobile, so we might see them maybe following their parents a little bit more. One behavior that we'll see from those adult individuals is something called escorting behavior. So a coyote will try to escort a perceived threat away. So one kind of call that we'll get often is, I'm walking down a trail and a coyote kind of appeared on the trail behind me or alongside me. And, they're not aggressively chasing me, they're not lunging, but they're following me. What do I do? And that coyote is likely just trying to escort you away from their den. So you probably got a little bit too close to their den site, and sometimes these dens might be right off of a walking trail. The coyotes just might not have realized how close they were. And so what they're trying to do is distract you. They think that you could potentially be a predator for their young pups. And so they're saying, hey, look at me, hey, look at me. You might want to follow me this way, or you might want to avoid me. They're really just trying to get you away from that area. So what you would do then is just calmly remove yourself. If you're with a dog, of course, keep them on leash. If you're with a small dog, pick them up, but really just remove yourself from that situation as calmly as possible. If it's just a coyote that's kind of following you, you're always welcome to make a lot of noise, try to spook them away, but really the best thing that we can do is just remove ourselves from that situation. Great question.
Thank you for such a thorough response, Dana. A few questions have also come in about wolves and coyotes and wondering why coyotes have been able to expand and persist despite centuries of persecution, whereas wolves really weren't able to be quite as resilient.
That's a great question. One of those reasons might just have to do with diet. So wolves are largely going to eat large mammals, ungulates, so elk, bison, moose, even just deer. And so these are really large animals, whereas coyotes are primarily going to eat a lot of smaller mammals, which might be a little bit more abundant. They're also a little bit more adaptable, so they can really, live anywhere. They can live in cities. They can live in urban parks and suburbs. So there's just a lot of different factors, but one of the main ones will really be their diet in how well they survive and adapt to different areas.
Thank you, Dana. And then we have a few questions about diet. And so I'll kind of group them together if that's okay with you. Do coyotes frequently eat animals that are larger than they are? And then when coyotes are eating smaller animals, will they try to swallow them somewhat whole or tear the flesh off? There's then some interest in scat analysis and how you can actually identify bones in the scat.
My kind of people. So coyotes aren't frequently taking down larger animals. Again, they might take down deer that are already injured, maybe ailing. That might be a little bit easier to take down, but eastern coyotes on average are 20 to 45 pounds. A white-tailed deer, for example, could be 90 pounds plus. So it's going to be quite difficult. For the most part, coyotes are going to be going after these smaller mammals. And because of that, they're not necessarily hunting in groups. They'll hunt as individuals or maybe as a pair. But you can imagine if they're going after chipmunks, there's not a whole lot to share. So they will actually swallow them whole frequently, maybe eat them in a few bites, but they'll pretty much eat everything on that animal. So they're not often, pulling them apart. Cats can be a little bit more picky. Sometimes bobcats, for example, will remove a squirrel's tail before eating them because, there's not a whole lot of meat there. It's just really fur. But coyotes will frequently just kind of eat the whole thing. So, of course, what goes in must come out. You will oftentimes see a lot of bones in that scat. So again, I recommend using gloves, or I recommend using a large stick. But if you're curious, you can start to break open that scat that you find on a trail. So comparing coyote scat to dog scat, for example, again, coyote scat will be sort of long and cylindrical. It typically has a tapered end, and it will often be rope-like in its consistency. So it has that kind of fur from the animals. But breaking it open, you'll see bones, you might see vegetation. With dogs, many of our dogs are eating kibble. So what you would see then is you're not going to see as much fur in the scat. You're not going to see bones. Breaking it open, it would look a little bit more uniform, kind of like they've consumed cornmeal. So you're not going to see a ton of variation in there. And then for bobcats, for example, their scat is, you know, a little bit more segmented. It was described to me once as kind of Tootsie Rolls squished together, which I hope I didn't just ruin that candy for everyone. And bobcats are obligate carnivores, so you're not really going to see a ton of vegetation in there. You're really mostly just going to see bones and fur. So it can be really interesting if you're feeling brave to look at this coyote scat. And again, it's a great research tool and just kind of a tool of curiosity because it's non-invasive. It doesn't influence their behavior at all to break open this scat and take a look. Whereas something like collaring them for research is a little bit more invasive. It involves a lot of handling, and that can be quite stressful. So it's a really interesting tool for us to explore.
Agreed. And then while you had mentioned bobcats just quickly at the end, so I might squeeze this question in here. How do coyotes interact, if at all, with other predators that they're sharing the landscape with? For example, bobcats and black bears.
That's a great question. Interestingly enough, I actually just saw a trail camera video today of a coyote and a black bear traveling down a trail together. I am not sure how real that video is, but I'm sure that it does happen on occasion, that these animals might form partnerships of some sort, or they just happen to be in the same place at the same time. But for the most part, black bears and coyotes are not going to interact very much. They might encounter one another if they're scavenging on the same meal. So for example, a deer carcass, then that might be a little bit of a negative interaction. They might try to chase one another off. Coyotes and bobcats, you know, they're not frequently encountering one another, at least, you know, not a significant encounter. They'll of course see one another. They have a lot of overlap in their diet, but there doesn't seem to be too much known conflict between them. Here we have a lot of red foxes, and for the most part, it seems like they coexist quite well, but in some areas we will see that coyotes and gray foxes can have a little bit more of a competitive relationship. And a lot of that is because gray foxes are a bit smaller than red foxes. So on occasion, coyotes might prey on them, but it's certainly not a significant component of their diet. So for the most part, you know, coyotes will kind of fit right in with a lot of these other species. With larger animals, maybe wolves or mountain lions, they might become prey. More often with mountain lions, they will be prey. In a past research project, I would hike in on mountain lion kills using those GPS points, and we would sometimes find that they had killed and consumed coyotes. So that's not something that we'll see in the Northeast because we don't have any mountain lions, but it really just kind of depends on the individual species that we're talking about.
Thanks, Dana. We then have several questions relating to coyotes living in urban environments. Some of the questions are in terms of city planning. How can cities best, or with developing cities, how can they best factor in wildlife and thinking about open spaces that benefit both wildlife and people? And then what approach should residents take if cities take steps to begin lethal efforts to remove coyotes from the landscape?
Those are great questions. So I would say that it would be very difficult in terms of city planning to effectively exclude coyotes. They have been known to travel along train tracks, cross bridges, swim if it's not too distant of a space between land. So they might swim out to islands, things like that. So if they are so inclined, they will likely find their way into a city, and particularly when there are parks. So there have been a lot of studies kind of examining territory size, and they will find that in a lot of these cities, you know, their territories for these individual coyotes or these groups won't be very large because they're very resource rich. So of course, in cities, we have lots of rodents, abundant food. And so oftentimes in these kind of urban and suburban parks, that park might be their entire territory because they really don't need to expand beyond that. So we will see variation in territory size based on abundance of resources. The wolves are howling now, and we probably can't hear them, unfortunately. And then in terms of what we want to do, if we have you know, village administrators and officials making these decisions to lethally remove coyotes, is we want to lend our voices. So we know through multiple studies that, you know, removal is just not effective. The science does not support it. But the best thing that we can do to mitigate human coyote conflict is use these preventative measures. So hazing them, really discouraging them from becoming too comfortable. So even if we have coyotes that have become emboldened, if we have individuals that are a little bit too comfortable, again, they're quite clever and they can actually relearn that people are scary. We just have to really commit to our hazing efforts. So it's definitely something to think about. And, you know, it's something that we want to voice to our officials that we don't support removal of coyotes, and we certainly don't support relocation, which is illegal and also not humane, but that we want to support our coyote population as they are.
Thanks, Dana. And then a last question about urban coyotes that I think we've all wondered at some point, because they're so and can be so elusive, where would urban coyotes sleep?
That's a great question as well. So sometimes they might, you know, sleep just in a park. Coyotes love golf courses. So you can imagine, I mean, there are tons of rabbits on golf courses. There's tons of available prey. And, you know, they might just be sleeping near a fallen tree in a park. And in particularly urban settings, who knows, they could just be sleeping kind of in an alleyway if that's their best available option. Again, they are quite resourceful, and they won't necessarily sleep, you know, for 10 hours at a time, so they might just need somewhere to rest for a few moments. But, you know, they'll really make do with whatever's around. So it can be kind of fascinating to think about, if I were a coyote, where would I sleep? Where would I hang out in this urban setting?
Fascinating. And I think maybe we have so many questions and we just won't be able to answer all of them, but maybe in a way to kind of wind down this question and answer portion of the program tonight. A lot of people are wondering how they can discuss coyotes with people who have misconceptions about these animals. What resources can they give them? How can they best approach the situation in a manner that is informative and not necessarily hostile? How can they change minds through education?
It can certainly be difficult when people have made up their minds about certain species of animals, especially given a lot of the mythology and misunderstanding surrounding some of them, particularly coyotes. So approaching it gently if you can is definitely my advice, but we do have a lot of resources on our website that Regan, I believe, will you'll be putting our coyote page in the chat. We do have a lot of resources, a lot of infographics that you can share, but just getting folks to understand that coyotes do have a rightful place in the ecosystem, that they are really crucial, and despite all of these things that we've been told about them, they are really beneficial. And you know, they belong. So trying to get people to understand that coyotes are not out to eat our children, they're not actively seeking out our pets, and that there are things that we can do to, you know, make sure that our loved ones are protected, and that, you know, you're far more likely to be killed by a flying golf ball than you are to even be bitten by a coyote. so that they would much prefer to stay far away from us. And so we want to maintain that distance as best as we possibly can. So it can be frustrating, it can be difficult to get people to understand that, you know, coyotes are not out to get us, these other wild animals, they're not out to get us, but that we just have to learn how to coexist with them, and that is really the best way to prevent any sort of conflict from happening.
Thank you so much, Dana.
I appreciate your efforts too.
Yes, agreed. All efforts to create a better world for coyotes and all wildlife are very much appreciated. So once again, thank you so much to everyone for joining us for tonight's program. And thank you to Dana for sharing her insights and advice as to how we can best coexist. I did take a moment to put Dana's email in the chat. If anyone is living in a community where you think it might be beneficial to have Dana give tonight's presentation to your neighbors or colleagues, feel free to contact Dana. She'd be happy to extend this program to your communities. And we did also post a link to our Eastern Coyote page in the chat as well. But thank you so much to everyone for joining tonight and for supporting coyotes and the Wolf Conservation Center in your everyday lives. And as a reminder, if you would like to replay this program, we will have a recording available on our website within the next few days, and you could certainly share the presentation with any friends or family who might be interested as well. But with that, thank you once again to everyone for joining tonight's program. Thank you to Dana, and please feel free to reach out with any questions or concerns. We'd be happy to answer them. Thank you so much, everyone, and have a wonderful evening.